The Caucasus is a land that looks designed to resist empires. Rivers cleave granite and limestone into a maze of canyons. Ridges rise like the ribs of the earth. Narrow passes funnel movement into singular, defensible points. For millennia, its peoples, Georgians, Armenians, Chechens, Circassians, Dagestanis, Ossetians, and many smaller groups, lived in villages clinging to terraces and ledges, communicating across valleys by signal fires and fast riders. In the early 19th century, when the Russian Empire turned its attention decisively southward, that landscape became the stage for one of the most protracted and bitter campaigns of imperial conquest in modern history, the Caucasian War, roughly 1817 to 1864. To understand why Russia committed decades of blood and treasure to those mountains, one must see the region through the eyes of 19th century strategists. The empire, having absorbed the kingdoms of eastern Georgia early in the century and recovering from wars with Persia and the Ottoman Empire, wanted a secure southern frontier. The Caucasus lay between the Black Sea and the Caspian, a chain of potential threats and opportunities. Control of the highlands would protect the fertile Georgian lands, and the Trans-Caucasian corridor, deny Ottoman and Persian influence among the mountain peoples, secure lines of communication to newly annexed territories, and open the way for trade. There was also a political logic. Empires measure themselves by borders held and by the submission of independent peoples. For Tsarist governors and generals, the Highlanders' raids, the hospitality to fugitives, and the refusal to accept imperial law were not merely local disorders, but threats to state authority. Russian policy in the 1810s and 1820s reflected those motives. Military governors, most famously Alexei Yermolov, believed that fortresses, roads, and an unyielding posture would break mountain resistance. Yermolov's tenure in the Caucasus from 1860s marked the beginning of an intense militarization. Ring forts on passes, the reconstruction of garrisons, and punitive expeditions into Ols, the mountain villages, that aimed to punish and deter. These were not campaigns of set-piece battles on open ground. They were wars of attrition in ravines, of columns trying to force mountain communities into submission. Yermolov's methods became infamous for their severity: destruction of villages, forced resettlement of suspected bands, and the encouragement of Cossack settlement along the Terek and Kuban rivers to provide loyal frontiersmen. Time and again, Russian columns learned that a fortified tower, a narrow defile, and well-placed muskets could blight a day of marching and leave whole detachments broken. Resistance in the eastern highlands, chiefly Chechnya and Dagestan, grew into a coherent movement in large part through religion. Sufi orders, particularly the Qadiriyya, provided a structure that bound disparate communities into a polity that was more than a collection of clans. From the 1820s, a charismatic cadre of religious leaders and military commanders fashioned a Murid movement. Murids were disciples, bound by spiritual allegiance to imams and sheikhs who claimed the authority to wage holy war against the unbelieving invader. The Imamate that emerged in the 1830s crystallized this fusion of faith and arms into an organized resistance. That resistance had leaders who became names of legend. Ghazi Muhammad, the first Imam, and his successors laid the religious and organizational groundwork. It was Imam Shamil, however, who would become the symbol of tenacity. Shamil, an Avar from Dagestan, consolidated rival groups and drew authority from both spiritual teaching and military competence. Under his leadership from the mid-1830s, the Imamate controlled large swathes of the eastern highlands, imposing order in places where clan law had reigned, and using mountain fortresses to frustrate Russian offensives. For a quarter century he eluded capture, and drew from the terrain to make the Russian army pay dearly for every mile. Russian commanders adapted in turn. Larger-scale sieges of mountain strongholds, the building of roads and staged winter offensives were combined with punitive raids, blockhouses, and the relocation of entire populations to deny the rebels shelter and supplies. In 1839, General Grab led a major assault on Akhulgo, a nearly impregnable rock citadel above the Sulak River. What followed was a bloody siege that culminated in the destruction of much of the fortress and heavy casualties on both sides. Shamil escaped, slipping through the enemy lines, the kind of episode that fed both his mythic status and Russian resolve. The war was not a tale of continuous imperial victory. Between larger-scale expeditions and sieges, there were ambushes, night raids, and raids in reverse. Mountain fighters seizing Russian supply trains, isolating small garrisons, retreating into passes with the loot and hostages. The character of the mountain war was shaped by the land, Scant forage, freezing winters, and thin soils for agriculture made logistics a constant problem. Russian columns, often marching with heavy artillery, were vulnerable in defiles and subject to attritional attacks. The Highlanders, by contrast, practiced a form of mobility warfare, knowledge of every ledge and goat trail, an ability to melt into the landscape, to fight hard, and then disappear. The Murid War married guerrilla tactics to a moral religious imperative. The struggle was for faith, autonomy, and honor. That combination made the conflict extend over decades. Yet the imperial pressure wore down one bastion after another. The Crimean War of 1853 to 1856 briefly distracted Russian attention and gave hope to some Highlanders that the Ottoman Empire might intervene more decisively. In the end, however, the European settlement left Russia free to concentrate on subduing the Caucasus. In 1859, after a sustained campaign by a new generation of commanders, Imam Shamil was finally trapped at the mountain stronghold of Gunib. Encircled by superior forces and cut off from supplies, he surrendered. His capture was not merely a military event, it was symbolic. The Imamate, as a central, cohesive resistance structure, collapsed with Shamil's fall, though guerrilla bands continued to fight. If the Eastern resistance had been organized around the Imam and the Murid network, the Northwest presented a different challenge. The Circassians, inhabiting the Black Sea foothills and the Western Caucasus, fought to preserve their villages and coastal spaces. They were confederations rather than an imamate, ethnically and politically diverse, organized by tribal consortia and local princes, and linked by a tradition of warrior society. They rejected Russian authority with stubborn constancy and used the sea for supply and refuge. Ottoman and British interests sometimes intersected with their cause, making the Black Sea coast another theatre of great power diplomacy. By the late 1850s and early 1860s, the war in the Northwest became increasingly a war of consolidation for the empire. Campaigns were designed not merely to defeat armed men, but to clear entire districts of any potential support for irregular fighters. This was the age of scorched earth. In the Russian Caucasus, villages were burned, crops destroyed, wells fouled, and surviving populations were sometimes driven to the coast or coerced into surrender. A harsh calculus governed the operations: deny the enemy refuge, settle loyal colonists and Cossacks in strategic valleys, move populations to make the frontier secure. What followed in 1864 was the final phase of the imperial push, the mass displacement and exile of large portions of the Circassian population. The coastal ports of the Black Sea became way stations for convoys of refugees bound for the Ottoman Empire. Contemporary Ottoman records document waves of arrivals that overwhelmed ports and transformed Ottoman social life in the principalities that received them. Refugees took on new names, adapted to new lands, and created diasporas that long remembered the mountains they had left. Within Russian and European discourse of the time, the removals were described variously as resettlement, refugee flows, or as harsh but unavoidable consequences of war. Circassian survivors and later historians have termed the events differently, with some calling them ethnic cleansing or genocide. Modern scholarship notes that the scale of death and displacement was severe. Many thousands, and according to some estimates, hundreds of thousands died in flight from exposure, starvation, disease, and violent incidents. Exact figures are contested, reflecting the nature of 19th century record-keeping and the political implications of memory. What is incontrovertible is that whole communities were uprooted, their old homelands repopulated by Cossacks, colonists, and peasants from other parts of the empire, and that the demographic map of the Western Caucasus was permanently transformed. The human cost of the Caucasian War was not confined to the Circassian coast. In the eastern mountains, families were torn apart by conscription into irregular bands, by punitive raids that burned homes and slaughtered livestock, and by cycles of revenge between clans and imperial detachments. Villages were depopulated, mountain economies were disrupted, and for many, the long years of conflict meant food shortages, disease, and the slow erosion of traditional life. The Russian army suffered heavily as well. Officers and soldiers lost their lives in ambushes, under siege, and in the brutal cold of mountain winters. The empire spent vast sums, money, men, and material, to build roads, fortifications, and garrisons, and to transplant populations. The Cossacks who settled the borderlands became both instruments and inheritors of Russian policy, entrusted with keeping the peace. They lived as a frontier society, often at the expense of former inhabitants. To describe the campaigns solely as military engagements, however, would miss their cultural and political consequences. The war brought the Highlanders into the orbit of imperial administration. New legal regimes, taxes and conscription were imposed. Orthodox and imperial schools and churches accompanied bureaucrats. The image of the Caucasus in Russian culture hardened as a region of danger and romanticized savagery, then as a place to civilize and settle. For local societies, the war and its aftermath reordered social hierarchies. Some local elites accepted imperial rule and were incorporated as administrators. Others were marginalized or fled. Diasporas formed in Ottoman lands, carrying with them memories, songs, and a politics of loss that would echo for generations. Geography, too, was altered. Roads and military lines carved the mountains, forts became towns. The Russian Empire established a series of administrative divisions, laid down military roads such as the Georgian Military Road through the central passes, and reshaped the flow of trade and travel. Population transfers and resettlement programs changed who held the valleys and the coastal plains. Where once local laws and clan pacts regulated affairs, imperial statutes now applied. In place of a mosaic of self-governing Alls and Highland republics, now stood a network of governors, gendarmerie, and military districts. Memory, perhaps unsurprisingly, became contested. Official Russian accounts would long emphasize the triumph over brigands and the pacification of a dangerous border. Local memories preserved tales of heroism, betrayal, and loss. In the Ottoman domains, new Circassian communities would contribute to the social life of cities from Constantinople to Jaffa, in the Caucasus. The absence of those communities created clear spaces, literal and figurative, later filled by other groups. Historians, meanwhile, debated both the practical necessity of Russian policies and the morality of the methods employed. Modern scholars emphasize that while imperial motives included strategic and economic calculations, they were also wrapped in ideologies of civilization and control that justified severe measures. By the time the last organized pockets of resistance were subdued in 1864, the political geography of the Caucasus had been fundamentally reconfigured. The Russian Empire had succeeded in creating a new borderland, a belt of loyal settlements, fortified towns and garrisoned roads that linked the Black Sea to the Caspian under imperial administration. The peoples of the highlands had been forced into new relationships with the center, as subjects, as refugees, as settlers in distant lands, or as marginalized communities within their own valleys. Those changes would prove durable. The demographic shifts, the scars of war, and the imperial infrastructures laid in the mid-19th century were all factors that shaped the region's modern map. The legacy of the Caucasian War is visible in the political landscape that emerged in the 20th century. The territories that had once resisted, Chechnya, Dagestan, the Kuban and the western coastal regions, entered into new political realities under Soviet rule, where the administrative divisions and population arrangements forged under the Tsars were institutionalized and, at times, exacerbated. Diasporas, in the Ottoman world, maintained memory and political identity, and later would play roles in the nationalist currents that swept the region. The memory of exile and the memory of conquest became part of the identities of many communities in the north and the northwest. This is the first chapter in a long, often painful sequence, not only the story of mountains conquered, but the story of how an empire remade a frontier and how peoples remade themselves in exile and under new administrations. It is a story of strategy and faith, of roads and ravines, of sieges and escapes, and of human lives displaced or extinguished in the grind of imperial ambition. In the episodes that follow, we will trace how the transformations set in motion by the Caucasian War carried forward into the 20th century through the upheavals of revolution and the Soviet experiment, and into the complex tapestry of modern conflicts and states that still contend with the memories of those convulsive decades.